Hello, our topic is the Venezuelan crisis. I'm Angela.
I'm Trini.
Eric. I'm Taylor.
So currently, Venezuela is going through a socioeconomic crisis where a lot of their people are starving just due to the fact that there's not a lot of necessary items in places such as grocery stores, or just prices are super inflated to the point where money's basically worthless. I can't speak, but it's come to the point where the people are trying to protest, but it's the situation just continues to deteriorate. The government isn't really doing much to kind of fix the program or fix the problem. So we're doing our. I literally cannot speak. I don't know what to say. So yeah, it kind of started back with President Hugo Chavez and his socialist views, and that's kind of how the whole crisis started. And then the current president, President Maduro, has been confronted numerous times by numerous interviewers, and they've actually asked him what he's currently trying to do to fix the problem, but he denies it. So a lot of people from Venezuela right now are just moving out of the country and fleeing to other places just because they're living in such poverty. The crime has gone up, poverty has gone up, so it's really hard to live there. A lot of people rely on outside family to help them out. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. And then my thesis, like some of the reasons that I believe that where this crisis has stemmed from. One of the reasons I think is due to the socialist views of Hugo Chavez, because that's basically how the problem started, because he wanted to implement this economy and this system of government that can. The idea of it sounds good. He tried to set up like universal health care and free housing for people, but ultimately it didn't work out, as you can see in the current crisis. And then another point I think is also political corruption, just because for the most part, if you look into the past, most of the leaders are just trying to gain power in the country and not really doing anything to fix the current issues. And then another one is lack of natural resource management. Venezuela is a country that's extremely rich in oil and is very poor right now. And so Venezuela isn't managing their natural resources well enough. They rely strictly on oil. So one of the reasons for this crisis was because the price of oil dropped, and so they weren't getting as much revenue as they could. So that explains why they can't even put items on grocery shelves, and why everything's super inflated and it's so hard just to purchase something. So that's my viewpoint on the matter.
Yeah, and my thesis was, I think that the root cause behind the Venezuelan crisis is the government system and the leaders such as Hugo Chavez, as Angela briefly talked about, and Nicolas Maduro, who is the current president. And the actions of these men that are continuing to just lead the country deeper and deeper into crisis rather than fixing it.
My thesis briefly was a mixture of two things. One, government. Started with Hugo Chavez and kind of how he led the country, and then leading with Nicolas Maduro, the current president, and how he's running things. And then the other part of my thesis was the mismanagement of resources and how they could have been better at not just focusing solely on oil, but expanding to other areas of their economy.
Yeah, and for myself, my thesis was on the basis of the government system, and how due to past government systems such as the colonization of Venezuela through the Spaniards, we see kind of after their independence and further out that they were because of the influence of the Spaniards and how they affected their resources, and as well other things, they their government systems or their government leaders kept to that same ideal of using the resources for their own personal gain, and how, as we can see in the Industrial Revolution with the oil, and later on with the current crisis that they're going through right now, they're feeling those effects in a sense.
So yeah, we just wanted to define a few terms for you guys, just so there's no confusion. You guys know what we're all talking about. The first term.
So first we have Hugo Chavez. You've heard his name a little bit by now, but he was basically who kind of implemented the changes in Venezuela to lead the country towards the state that it is in now. He was the president of Venezuela before the current president. He died a few years ago. He was just the former president of Venezuela, and he was the one who enacted many of the changes that are occurring today.
Okay, yeah, and I wanted to define Nicolas Maduro for you, the current president. He was elected. He's currently serving as the 63rd president of Venezuela, and he was elected in 2013. And before that, he served as vice president to Hugo Chavez, and kind of his predecessor, and models the way he leads after Hugo Chavez.
Yeah, and I would like to explain what crisis is, so that we're kind of all on the same page of what the Venezuelan crisis comes out to be. But a crisis, as we can find in the dictionary, in the Google, from Google, is any event that is going to lead to an unstable and dangerous situation affecting an individual, group, community, or whole society. And so, as we can tell with the Venezuelan crisis, this is the crisis or the situation that is affecting Venezuela right now.
Yeah, and another one is the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which was just a political party in Venezuela, and it formed from the fusion of a couple of the other political and social forces that supported the Bolivarian Revolution, which was led by Hugo Chavez. And then the Fifth Republic movement, which was a social political party that supported Hugo Chavez in his run for presidency in 1998. This movement was aimed to refound the republic through a constitutional assembly.
And then the last one we want to talk about was inflation. You'll hear a little bit about that throughout the presentation. That's basically when prices of goods and services rise and purchasing power of a dollar or currency falls. It becomes useless, the currency. So
awesome. So, okay, no, my bad, my turn. So to begin, we kind of wanted to go into the government system and how this started it all. How the government system, from going back, like I was saying, explaining before, how the Spanish influenced the government system that Venezuela has been going on and off for the past couple of centuries even. And so with the colonization of Venezuela from the Spaniards, the Spanish came over and colonized the people. Unlike most colonizations, this one wasn't, at least in the textbooks, they don't explain how, in my research, it wasn't as bad or crazy, as other ones that we hear of, like massacres or like a ton of killings. This one was kind of a little bit more low-key. The people weren't as aggressive towards the Spanish, and this was kind of a good thing for them, but at the same time was a bad thing, as we can tell with if they had been a little bit more aggressive and fought more, that they wouldn't have such, in my opinion, such a crappy government system right now. And so, going on with that, as the years went by, one of the government leaders, his name being something Bolivar, Simon. Okay, Simon Bolivar. He was one of the people that had moved to Spain, kind of gained an education, and then wanted to gain an independence for Venezuela. And so he kind of came back and fought for that independence, and they received it, and he became one of the first government officials for the independent Venezuelan Republic. And so we can see kind of in that, as it goes down the line, there were a lot of military government officials, government leaders, such as Hugo Chavez, as was mentioned, and this man that have kind of shaped how Venezuela chooses their leaders, and how Venezuela kind of had put themselves in a situation like this for not, even though they did gain independence, they didn't necessarily gain independence on that threshold mentally or for themselves.
And talking about colonization, one thing that the angle I was kind of looking at was post-colonization, and we talked a little bit about this in class when England was basically taking over Africa, and they kind of ruled, they took over Africa, and after the English, after Europe left, Africa was kind of mismanaged. They didn't really know how to rule themselves. They didn't really know how to run an efficient government or to run a stable economy. And it was the same thing that Venezuela kind of experienced when, post-colonization, after Spain left, they really didn't know what to do. And so that is when I think the military came in and kind of took power, and that's when some of the first mismanagement of government started to take place in Venezuela.
Yeah, and going off of that, just as what Taylor was saying, that Spain came in and conquered Venezuela, and the angle that I sort of took from it was just all the problems that they've had from the start as they gained their independence. Communism actually is the longest government party in Venezuela, which I thought was very interesting to just see problems as they've continued to arise. And going along with government, something that I thought was very interesting was as Hugo Chavez was campaigning, he was going more for democracy, but eventually, as he was put into office, he changed back to socialism, which is where he was part of the Fifth Republic movement, which ultimately became the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. So we can see that he went back to the socialistic ways, and we can see just throughout history how this has continued to be a pattern for the people in Venezuela.
Oh, okay. So, one of the things, government-wise, so Venezuela is in the current crisis it is today because of the socialist government system that they have implemented. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Hugo Chavez and his views, his socialist views. There's actually a quote by him where he says, I'm just going to read it from here. It says, "Democracy is impossible in a capitalist system. Capitalism is the realm of injustice and a tyranny of the richest against the poorest." Rousseau said, "Between the powerful and the weak, all freedom is oppressed. Only the rule of law sets you free. That's why the only way to save the world is through socialism, a democratic socialism." Like Trini was talking about, he started going towards a democratic system, but then switched to socialism. So he's on a democratic socialist system. He said, "Democracy is not just turning up to vote every 4 or 5 years. It's much more than that. It's a way of life. It's giving power to the people. It is not the government of the rich over the people, which is what's happening in almost all the so-called democratic Western capitalist countries." So Hugo Chavez, his goal was to give all the power to the people of Venezuela and take away the power from the higher class, from the richer people. But ultimately that ended up in the situation that we have today. He tried to implement universal health care. He tried to do all these things to better the situation of the people in Venezuela, but somehow it's still, socialism is an idea that sounds good when you say it, it's on paper, but it's very hard to implement just because you can't give everyone what they want. It's just, it won't work out. And yeah, he also, he was very set on socialism. In one of the conferences he was invited to in the United Nations, he actually talked about the United States, and he actually mentioned how the United States and other capitalist countries to him it's evil and it's holding the world back, and that his socialist ideas and his way of doing things was the way to better the world. That's what he said in that press conference. And his relationship with the United States was not very good at all, just because he hates capitalist systems, things like that. And this kind of ties back to President Mao, when we learned about in China, how President Mao's idea of progress, he believed that moving up towards the ladder, towards socialism, towards communism, was his way of moving up in the world. It allowed his country to better fight for their place, and that would make them a world power, and that's also what Hugo Chavez believed. And then, let me see. So he tried to implement these laws and these socialist laws, and he just thought it was the key to a better country. And then to tie into that, so power and progress, that ties into it. And then also political corruption was also another thing. While Hugo Chavez, he said that his goals were to help the people of Venezuela, ultimately, in a sense, he was only really helping himself. And that even ties into, again, President Mao. Like, they're living these great lives where other people are doing all the work to move their country up the ladder. And then that even ties into the current president today. It's actually in the news how it talks about how President Maduro, like, he's out eating these nice fancy meals while his people are starving. They have nothing to eat. People are actually rummaging through the trash, or like going to the streets and even resorting to theft just because they can't afford any food. There was actually this one video where it showed some Venezuelans in Colombia, and they were just like serving hot dogs, and they were talking about how it would take like a month's salary in Venezuela to just afford a hot dog. Like, that's bad. And then President Maduro, when confronted in interviews about what he's doing to fix the situation, in one interview he was confronted what he was planning on doing to fix the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and he said that there was no humanitarian crisis, that Venezuela is fine, and they explain to him that his people are starving, and he just says that he's actually said that they're on a diet. He calls it the Maduro diet. Yeah, it's kind of crazy how he says that, because he's like, oh, because the people before were so fat and they were eating so much, now they're on this diet, and that's why they're skinnier, because they're on this Maduro diet. That's what they call it. So that's just interesting, seeing the political corruption and what people are willing to do to other people just to stay in power. So yeah, that's what I got. There we go.
Yeah, speaking of the Maduro diet, it reminds me, I read an article where it said that Maduro said that the people of Venezuela need to practice, they need to be more fiscal disciplined. They need to learn how to spend their money better, but now they don't have any money and can't buy anything. So, but part of power and progress was what Angela said. Hugo Chavez's campaign was he wanted all the power. He wanted the people to have all the power. And that's how he was elected, and that's why his approval rate was so high in the beginning. But as he started to implement those changes, the socialist and programs, or the socialized idea, his approval rate started to decline fast. And so he dumped all this money in these socialist programs, quick fixes, promising all these things, and just to get his approval rate back up, and all the people started to like him again. And that was just it was easy cover, it was an easy fix to the problem, it was all surface level. And after a while, Nicolas Maduro is kind of doing the same thing, but now his approval rate's at like an all-time low.
Yeah, and going along with that, Hugo Chavez and the current president, they're trying to fix the problem in their own sense, just as Eric was saying, that it fixed it for a little bit. One thing that Hugo Chavez did that I thought was interesting and that I think helped put the country more into crisis was in 2003 he started to put, he wanted to exchange bolivars for dollars. They had to apply for a government currency agency, and so with this, it was a fixed, a foreign foreign currency controls. And with this, everything just dropped in prices, and everything was just becoming way too expensive to produce and way too much to upkeep. Therefore, it wasn't even worth it. That everything in the store was just becoming obsolete, basically, because people couldn't afford it. Which ties into what Angela was saying, that this was happening in 2003, but even in the current video of them buying a hot dog would take a whole month's salary. To see that this problem was in the beginning, but also still coming up, that even though as he tried to fix it, it still wasn't being fixed.
Yeah, and then kind of to wrap it up on Hugo Chavez, my take on that one, kind of the perspective that I researched, kind of due to one of the articles that I read explaining about how he came into office. It said that his victory, and this is from one of the reporters, said that his victory reflected the discontent among Venezuela's poor with the political establishment and created uncertainty about the future of the nation's 40-year-old democracy and Latin America's fourth largest economy. And so, kind of from that report, we understand that at the time when Hugo Chavez came into power, it was Venezuela was still having those political downfalls, kind of those ups and downs that they had, starting with the oil, and later on, kind of we see that once Chavez was in office, that from this article says that Chavez nationalized industries and made it easier for Venezuelans to get food, education, healthcare, and housing. And so in the beginning, it was easy for him because of his radical way of being, the demands that he had as a socialistic leader, in wanting people to have everything, kind of like what Angela was saying, to give everybody everything that they wanted. And at first, for the people of Venezuela, this is what they wanted. They wanted the now instead of what was going to happen in the future if a socialistic leader were to come into power. And so we kind of see the effects because of their reliance on oil, and we'll talk more about oil as we go on with our presentation, but how that affected the people of Venezuela. And so kind of to end off with that, the research that I had about Hugo Chavez, it says, but after oil prices started to fall in late 2008, that level of spending became unsustainable and the economy suffered. And so, as we can tell with the Venezuelan crisis, not only the economy, but kind of as Trini was saying as well, like it is a humanitarian crisis because the people don't have that food to eat or any of the things that Hugo Chavez did offer in the very beginning, which they had at the time, but because of lack of management for their economy when it came to oil, and with the other resources that they did have that they could have used, the economy did fall, and is still in a corrupt state. That's it.
The next thing that we wanted to talk about was oil. And the view that I kind of took from oil, because I talk a lot about how the government system is what led to the corruption, but the economic system is what also led to that. And so oil has been one of the biggest things in Venezuela. It's honestly what's kept Venezuela sustainable as a country. And so a little statistic, in the Venezuelan analysis, it says that between 1920 and 1935, oil's share of export went from 1.9% to 91.2%. And so we can see that the country, after they gained their independence and started to be on their own, that they had this huge amount of oil come in, and they were able to get their wealth from this, and they sort of depended on it for a long time. But one of the problems that they had in their government system was that they didn't know how to properly manage it. Yeah, they didn't know how to set money aside. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to not be dependent on just oil. And so just as Taylor was saying in 2008, when those oil shares dropped, this country had nothing to depend on anymore. They had nothing to have currency or money come in. Their exports went down a lot. And so someone else talks about, a news reporter says that oil production accounts for 96% of Venezuela's revenue. And so you can see with only 4% of not coming in from oil, as oil went down, everything went down too in the economic and government system. And although the leaders are trying to help it out, everything that they're doing is starting to lead them down more, such as trying to put them on diets and not really addressing the fact these people have nowhere to go. They don't have money for food or shelter anymore, and so without their oil that they've had, they're kind of just, they don't have anything.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big part of my thesis as well. I think Trini talked, kind of touched it already, but just without oil, they become reliant on other countries for, a big piece of their economy, technological advances, lots of other resources, food. I mean, yeah, they become reliant, and with the economy suffering and the oil prices lower than ever, there's a statistic I have on one of my resources, one of my primary resources. I don't have it up, but I mean, with the oil at an all-time low, I mean, they're selling hundreds of thousands of oils, the numbers declining like crazy. They're becoming reliant on other countries. So.
Yeah, and going off of what Trini and Eric said, I have something similar to that. Like I said, part of my thesis was that I think that Venezuela just hugely lacked being able to properly manage their natural resources, because a country so rich in oil is typically a rich country. And Venezuela did thrive at some point, and they were doing well, but since they're not managing well what they're doing, once the prices of oil dropped, they had no revenue, they had no money to be able to import goods from other countries because they couldn't afford it. So that's why the grocery store shelves are empty right now. They can't even afford to import basic necessities such as toilet paper. If you go to a supermarket, there's huge long lines of people waiting for basic things like toothpaste or rice, things like that. And that's all because they weren't able to properly manage their money and be able to kind of diversify their spending. And so that was a huge factor in what led to today's crisis. And it continues to be a huge factor because their oil prices continue to drop, and that actually affects the world market, just because Venezuela is a huge player when it comes to oil, and it supplies other countries with oil, and so it's not only affecting the country within, but it's affecting other countries that get oil from them. So yeah.
And going along with that, I think we can all say that like the biggest people that are being affected by the Venezuelan crisis are the people of Venezuela. And kind of going along with that, as we have read and studied in our history class about the people that were under the Mao's reign, when they were sustaining the people of Russia, they began to give it became a competition where they would give everything to the people, the Russians, and in return they were left with nothing. Either the food that they sent out would rot in the trains that they sent out, or they just send everything and leave themselves nothing, and the people would starve and die. And so we can tell kind of that same effect on the people of Venezuela. They relied so heavily on oil that they forgot to kind of use other resources that they had in Venezuela, that when the economy did go down, that they stayed down with it, and because of lack of other resources, they could pull themselves back up out of the ground. And so kind of with that, like one of the things that was really important for the people of Venezuela was the industrial revolution, where they industrialized oil, but at the same time it became their downfall because they only industrialized in oil.
Yeah, and as you can see, we all have a little bit different views, but mostly the same views as to what we think really caused the Venezuelan crisis. We can see that government system plays a huge role. The presidents and the rulers that they've had, and oil experts as well.
Yeah, again, to just kind of go through our presentation, most of the things that we really talked about was the socialist views that led to the situation, and the oil, which we just talked about, it's a huge factor, and just political corruption. It's a problem everywhere, but specifically there, it's just a huge deal. So that's my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the mismanagement of resources, I think, played a huge role, and of course the government as well. But just, you know, becoming reliant on one source, I mean, it's never a good thing.
Yeah, and then kind of to wrap it up, like I feel that like one of the biggest effects of the Venezuelan crisis was their colonization, and how they from the beginning kind of never really got themselves back up mentally from that being trapped from the Spanish, and then from there every leader that they had afterwards kind of kept that same mental trap on their minds, and until even the people couldn't sustain it anymore, and they fell. And so that's kind of sort of presentation.
Yeah, and we also have an activity that we'll do at the end of our presentation. It's kind of tricky to do over the iPad right now, and we have a.
We have treats.
Yeah, we'll have a treat. Keep it a surprise.
Yeah,
So.
and then at the beginning of our presentation, we're gonna show a 3-minute video, kind of going through what exactly is going on, and it illustrates for people what's the current situation.
Yeah. And that's us.
31.